Excellent. Everyone, good morning and thank you and welcome. Welcome to our webinar this morning. Thank you for joining us. This is our strategic negotiations webinar with Patricia Lynn. I'm going to go off script a little bit here as part of my intro, but I know Patricia well enough, and I'm sure she's going to be okay with this. And by the way, Patricia is joining us from San Francisco. So if I talk for another minute or two, it'll give her a little bit more time to continue to wake up. So I'm going to go ahead and let you guys know a little bit about Patricia. So we know you guys are all busy and we know you have Zoom fatigue. So first of all, thank you. Your microphones are muted, your cameras are off, okay? And we'd like to thank you and appreciate you for joining us today. I'm Dave Gambasini, president of the New England CCIM chapter. And our webinar today is Strategic Negotiations. And joining us today for our discussion is Patricia Lynn, CCIM principal and founder of Link Strategies and instructor with the CCIM Institute. And this is where things get interesting. Patricia is literally, okay, the toughest negotiator you may ever meet. She is a black belt in Hawaiian Kempo, okay? Let this all sink in as I explain this, okay? She is proficient in swords, commas, and the bow staff, and she considers the butterfly sword her top weapon. I don't know what a butterfly sword is, and I've never used the terms my top weapon. Lynn has numerous accomplishments in grand divisions and including the 2018 NASCA Triple Crown Award for both women's weapons and women's forms, as well as countless 50+ weapons and forms awards between 2017 and 19. And if that's not enough, I believe if I have this right, she's an 8-time world Kempo champion, okay?
This is really off script, Dave.
Yeah, completely off script, but legitimately the toughest negotiator, okay? The toughest negotiator, and watch this. This is just to prove it. So you guys all know. Oh, wait, hold on. Technical difficulties, hold on. I got it. There we go, check this out. Come on, go. Ready? Completely off script here with you guys just love it. Instructor today. You want to pay attention. There it is. Oh, my kid's scared. I don't even know what's going on.
Okay.
Yeah. So again, everyone, thanks for giving me a minute there. Completely off script. I understand. It meant a lot to me. Patricia's become a good friend of mine. She's been one of my instructors in the past, and I know we're in for a real treat today. In general, she's going to take us through an interactive overview of the Institute's 3-step interest-based negotiations model and provide you with practical tools that you guys can put together right away. The big thing is, this isn't just professional, it is personal. So your camera's off, your microphones are off. Drop your questions in the Q&A ongoing. I'll be monitoring them. I'll help you guys out, answer questions as we go, and then we'll have an open Q&A at the end as well. This will be recorded, and if there's any questions for me, send them over, and if there's anything wrong with technical, send that over as well, and I'll get you guys to the right people. So without further ado, I think I've kind of hopefully warmed up the room a little bit for you. Patricia, please take us away.
Thank you, Dave. I guess there are no secrets, are there? Anyway, thank you. Well, jumping into this, I really appreciate you being here, and I'm so excited about this webinar. As Dave mentioned, I'm in California. I'm on the left coast. You're on the right coast, or west coast, east coast, and what we're going to talk about applies anywhere. Quick thank you, really quick thank you. We've thanked the sponsors, but I'd like to thank the unseen heroes, the superheroes of the pandemic, which are people behind the scenes at CCIM. A couple of them, Larry Guthrie and Ken Brown, are on right now, but they're the people who made our courses go live and took us on virtual and took us out to all of you who have been staying at home. So a big thumbs up and thank you for making this happen. This is the last of 6 of our regional webinars. I'd like to also thank the regional VPs and Holly Buchanan for coming up with the idea. And of course, I thank my friend Dave. Okay. This course is called Strategic Negotiations. I like to also call it How to Get What You Need and Sustain Long-Term Relationships, because we are in a relationship business. I go to Asia and I love, after I've worked in Asia, going to the markets and negotiating for chopsticks. We're not negotiating for chopsticks. We're not handling one-off negotiations. There are relationships involved. And this calls for a strategic plan in our negotiations, believe it or not, with objectives and steps or tactics that are driven by certain goals. And when I say tactics, I mean steps that you implement to make sure that you reach your goal. They're not reactionary, they're well thought out. So we're going to focus on relationship negotiation as opposed to one-off negotiation. Now, we have a poll here, and I'd like you to take a minute, just take a second to fill it in. I'd like to tell you that the poll is anonymous. Nobody will see what you've written. And go ahead, please, and fill in the poll. Oh, thank you. Thank you. You're jumping right on it. So this is interesting. Give it about 10 more seconds. What I'm seeing right now is almost a tie between buyers and sellers. And if we look at the family unit between spouses, significant others, and children, they're a little bit ahead in terms of who are most difficult negotiations. So take a look at this. We have 30% buyers and sellers, and between significant others and children, 49% or so. So the purpose of this poll isn't just to see if you're out there and reacting, but the purpose of this poll is to say that the very aspects and strategies that we're talking about with regard to negotiating in business also helps you with all other aspects of life as well. So this is going to be fun and very applicable. Now, we often look at negotiations as a necessary evil, a zero-sum game. There's a winner, there's a loser, and we're employing tactics to knock the other party off center in order to get what we want. And even if we consider ourselves a win-win negotiator, which many of us do, there's often a default pattern where there's still the element of one-upsmanship. We got the best deal, better deal than the other party. So our objective for this session is to think about our mindset around negotiations and whether we might want to look at changing that. And speaking of change, consider this quote: "Without changing our pattern of thought, we will not be able to solve the problems we created with our current patterns of thought." Now, I wish I'd come up with this quote, but it must be attributed to Mr. Einstein. And I like this because it sets the backdrop for how taking a fresh approach at considering negotiations. And change is difficult. Even in our one-day full-on deep dive into negotiations course, where we spend the entire day talking about interest and meeting parties' interests, we put people together in a negotiation, they still default to the traditional back and forth behavior that we employ. So I'd like you to just take a minute and think about mindset. During the last 6 months or so, there's been a little bit more time without the constant travel to actually read. And I've been reading some of the ancient philosophers, and there was a group called the Stoics in maybe 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, who are still being read by world leaders today. And they espouse certain virtues that were important. These were people who suffered plague, they suffered bankruptcy, they suffered court intrigue, and tremendous wars. And the stories of the Stoics are interesting when you look at everything that they dealt with. So their approach to dealing with the hardships of the world is that we don't have the choice externally of what happens, but we do have a choice of how we deal with that. And I think that's particularly applicable to our negotiations. Often it feels like a negotiation just gets thrown at us, and we have the choice of how we look at things. So what we must do is we must, where appropriate, either limit our perspective or expand our perspective to do whatever it is to keep us strategically most ready for the task at hand. So keep that in mind as we work through. You should have received a link to a couple of worksheets. If you didn't, don't worry about it. Take a picture of the screen or just grab a paper and write down your current negotiation that's the most important to you or the most bothersome to you right now, that's underway right now. Not one you just closed or not one that is you closed a while ago, but something that's going on currently. That will help you to take these tools that we're going to discuss, introduce and discuss, help you to think about applicability. And speaking of applicability, number of you have been in a course with me. You know that the way that I teach is very interactive. The classroom is a bit chaotic because we're all talking and all sharing ideas. And I'd like you to treat this next 45 minutes or so like you would a class. Jump in, use the chat room, be sure to ask questions in the Q&A, and be interactive as opposed to a sit back and listen webinar. Now, there is a reason why the CCIM Institute spent and devoted countless resources to finding the most appropriate style and approach to negotiations. And we're going to discuss the background on what we call our three-step negotiation process. We like this three-step process because it's linear, it's scientific, it's data-driven, just like the way that we approach the rest of our CCIM quantitative-based courses. And so what we hope you will take away from this is the idea to apply best practices constantly by using a discipline, focused, linear approach on discovering interest and collaborative problem solving. And we would like you to be able to implement a strategic approach to drive the process and the dialogue so that you can close deals more effectively. Now, real quickly, if you would, launch into the chat window what kind of current negotiations are keeping you awake at night, your specific negotiations. And this will help us to bring in content and frame it around these negotiations. So really quickly into the chat window, what kind of negotiations are keeping you awake at night? And I think my chat window's broken. Okay, here we go. Great. A property I own and selling, seller price negotiations, commissions, always commissions. Getting to a price that both buyer and seller agree to, buyer and seller expectations during COVID. Great. I see we're not talking about the family ones. These are negotiations with business, which is perfect for this. Accepting offer. So a lot of this is super. A lot of this is around pricing and negotiations on pricing. Working on a deal where my buyer's gone up multiple times, seller not. Again, high-low game pricing. This is terrific. Okay, thank you for that. That will help us quite a bit. Now, there are some challenges that occur that are unique to a relationship-oriented business, different from negotiating chopsticks in China. And more specifically, these challenges occur around the fact that our clients are very well informed. They know everything. There's access to everything on the internet. What impact does that have? Well, it could be that the perception of our value gets diminished because what do we have to offer? So there is the challenge, in order to avoid what we call fee compression, there is the challenge to fine tune and discern the information that is actionable for consumption by our clients. And as it relates to larger organizations, there are multiple stakeholders, and they all have different interests. And what's important for organizations is, even more than the financial aspect, is often just consensus and buy-in. So what we'll have as a result of these challenges is a tool that will help us to generate consensus, and we'll have the same opportunity to use our tools that we have when we apply our CCIM financial analysis tools. Let's take a little bit deeper dive into challenges. In my business, I didn't introduce exactly what I do, but after years in brokerage, I went into the consulting business, and I worked for a Big Four consulting firm advising corporations. And after some time with that Big Four firm, I formed my own company. And we advise, in addition to corporations, government entities, landowners, developers, nonprofits, brokerage firms. And one of the areas of study that we looked at quite a bit over the last 15 years has been that whole area of space utilization. You may know that at any one time, pre-COVID, occupancy in an office building was generally about 40%. In terms of a corporation owns a space, at any one time, only 40% of that space was occupied. So we spent a lot of time doing space utilization studies, both from the perspective of productivity and also from the perspective of having the company have the ability to reduce costs. So we'd look at, instead of 350 square feet per full-time employee, we'd look at something like trying to get down to maybe 90 square feet per full-time employee. So in all of this, we did all of these studies, and what was key was getting consensus on if we were downsizing the organization, getting consensus from all the parties involved. And then along comes the world has changed. So now there's discussion about private offices and no more benching, but now when we go back to our offices, we may need as much and even more space so that we can implement the proper distancing. And again, the bottom line is we must be able to constantly address the changing needs of our clients. Now, I love this. I love this. Corporations require consensus. And you see that on this chart, it's a little tongue-in-cheek, but on this chart, there's an arrow over to no, but no arrow over to yes in terms of consensus. And that's because consensus often tends to swirl until we can manage that process. And when I was in the brokerage business and I would bring a deal to a corporate client, it felt like, here's the deal, here's a proposal. It felt like I was tossing the deal over this giant, thick, impenetrable velvet curtain, and I never knew what happened on the other side. And what was happening on the other side was they were doing this swirl and trying to determine consensus before they came back to me with a solution to the problem. So again, the opportunity will be tools in sight that keep us organized and help them to make these decisions. Well, this looks like Mars and Venus, people speaking different languages, either culturally or literally. And the question of different languages is how can you interpret, whether it's within your household or whether it's in a giant negotiation, and make sure that we get down to communication that everyone understands. I love this one. There was a great book when I started in the business called Winning Through Negotiation. And the writer, it was a big deal book, and the writer talked about the ways that negotiators could steal your chips. And the second way they could steal your chips would be they would reach out, shake hands, and then hold the baseball bat behind their back and steal your chips that way. So yes, anybody ever dealt with difficult negotiators? I'm sure that you have along the way somewhere. Yeah, Carl. Hey, Carl, how are you? Yep. Yeah. So there are difficult negotiators out there, and we're going to talk about dealing with them too. So now we have opportunity in this world, in our approach to leverage our relationships, leverage our tools. And the way, one thing I want to say about this slide is the way that we can do that is we, again, take control and we drive the process. We drive the dialogue. Now, like the Stoics, we can't control the outcomes, but what we can do is control the process. And by controlling the process, we have an opportunity to influence the outcome. So let's talk a little bit about measuring success. And we like the idea of assessing your outcomes. Sorry, went backwards there. We like the idea of assessing your outcomes against internal goals, because that means that we are setting our own goals that are independent of external factors like competition and being strategic. A little bit about conflict. If we were in a class, we'd probably have a 10-minute discussion on conflict. And the idea is it necessary? And you might say, well, I don't really like conflict. I'd like to avoid conflict. Yeah, I love conflict. I think it's important. Conflict is a fuzzy line. And too much can be damaging, but you need to encourage enough conflict to understand diagnostically where the issues are so that you can get under the surface and begin to solve for them. There's often a tension, a tightrope that we experience in professional relationships. And it's the perceived trade-off between satisfying our own needs and satisfying the needs of others. And where we want to be is in this win-win zone rather than back here. But what happens, as depicted here, is we often end up compromising our needs to satisfy their needs, or asking them to compromise or sacrifice their needs so that we can have ours met. And what happens, you know what happens when you compromise. When you compromise, you end up in a suboptimal outcome for both sides. And so what we hope to do is design a way to use creativity to expand this pie. So rather than compromising, we're focusing on creative solutions. Two sisters were fighting over the last orange. Becky and Melissa both wanted the orange. Mother says, I'm in the other room, I'm on a Zoom meeting, I'm just, stop your bickering. And she comes in, she slices the orange in half. Here, Becky, here, Melissa, and she walks off. Well, Becky proceeds to peel the pulp out of the orange and grind it up and make orange juice. Melissa proceeds to chop up the peel and use it for a cake that she was mixing. So what happens is this compromise created a solution that left neither party happy, and the mother obviously ignored significant issues that could have added real value to the scenario. I like this quote by Stephen Covey. When you show deep empathy toward others, their defensive energy goes down and positive energy replaces it. And that's when you get to be more creative in your problem solving. Okay, my friend Dave, I have a deal for you. It was $15 million valuation. You've seen the appraisal, you know the building we're talking about on the corner of Main and Main. And right now, because we're friends, I'm going to offer you that deal at $10 million. So, you know, few minutes to make a decision, but this is a super deal and special discount for the friendship quotient. Are you out there?
I got to tell you, I mean, especially in COVID, there's just no way. You know, I'm reporting to a bunch of people. I mean, they probably got a couple million, a few million in this, but there's no way we're near 10 million.
Well, make me an offer, Dave. I know you'll be reasonable.
I mean, I have to talk to everyone else. I mean, maybe it's 2 million. I mean, we're in the middle of COVID. I have no idea.
$2 million, 2 million. Okay, well, I'll tell you what, just for now, because everybody's time is valuable here, I'll come down to 8.
I mean, maybe I can go to 3, but I have to, there's no way. There's just no way.
Dave, you're killing me. You're killing me. And so it goes. And I come down and Dave comes up, and then we reach an impasse. And then we think about it, we go away. You know, it's just a commission apart, they say. So we come lower, higher, and at some point we finally meet in the middle at somewhere where there's not happiness on either of our parts, and we both had multiple concessions to get here. And so you've all been through negotiations like this. Dave, how do you feel at the end of a negotiation like this? Back and forth. Take this out months, for example.
Yeah, I mean, really, there's obviously plenty of emotion in it, but when you look at it and think about it, to me, it feels very unsophisticated. You know, it feels unsophisticated, and it feels like you're playing the used car game.
Yeah, and aside from that, it's exhausting. We're playing this giant game of back and forth of chicken. And it takes two to play. You can't just say they're a tough negotiator and we're going to keep doing this. It takes two to play. And so there is a way to opt out of this back and forth. And it's one word, just one word. Go ahead and chat into the window, if you will. What's that one word that helps you to enables you to opt out of this high-low game? And it's a question, a one-word question that you can ask. Anybody? A one-word question that you can ask to get out of this high-low game. Dave, right on. Why? Why is the property worth that? Why can't you pay more than that? Why do you need a different timing associated with? Once we get underneath the hood and start to ask the interest, why do you need the orange? Then that gets us out of this loop. You might say to somebody, well, why? And they say, well, I just want to make a deal. But you keep digging at the why of it. A couple of other issues with the high-low game. You know, Dave may not even want to negotiate with me again. This is a very subtle point, but it actually makes liars of us. It actually makes liars of us. We said we're going to start, well, that's just a negotiating game. But we said we're going to start here. We won't take any less ever. Well, maybe I'll come down a bit. It also is, you know, we talked about a battle of wills. There's something called substantive, psychological, and procedural satisfaction that each party needs in order to complete and fulfill the deal. And if neither side is happy, they may be looking for other partners to bring in or ways to get out of the deal. And like the orange, it may ignore, that high-low game may ignore significant issues. So having said all of that, we have come to three basic premises from our interest-based negotiation program. And several years ago, maybe about 10 now, when we were undergoing a rewrite to our entire curriculum, we went out and looked for various philosophies of negotiating and that were consistent with our philosophy. And this came out of Harvard. We hired an organization to adapt it to our curriculum, and it is filtered through right now 103, 104, and then independent standalone course as well. And the premises that we begin with are that people always act in their own interest. We can debate that, but you will find that unless they are not with us completely, they will always act in their own interests. And if we can find ways to satisfy those interests, then we have the opportunity to have a successful negotiation. And the last premise is that we always must consider the consequence of not doing the deal, because that impacts how you negotiate. So this leads us to our CCIM three-step negotiating process. And if you start with the assumption that people make decisions based on their own interests, the first step would be the stakeholder analysis, determining who's involved. And this is foundational for setting the tone for the rest of a negotiation. The second premise is that we must find creative ways to satisfy those interests. So we look at, as a tool, a brainstorming process, tying the interest to action steps. And then the third is what we call our risk analysis. How does the consequence of no deal impact the negotiation? Now, step one starts with a tool called a stakeholder interest chart. And it is on that page that you may have downloaded. And it gives us the opportunity to, along here, the top, identify the stakeholders, along the side, identify the issues, and then for each stakeholder, what they need with regard to each issue. There are many ways of organizing a stakeholder interest chart. Here's an example of one, and we've got typical issues. I love this. It's where's the CEO live? And tax relief, signage, etc. And then what each stakeholder wants or how they feel about the issues. So as you are thinking about your negotiation underway, think about how you would identify the stakeholders, for example, across the top. Real case study. I'm calling it Florida Farms. This was a third-generation family, civic leaders. 3 siblings had inherited this property, and they'd had offers from developers for tune of $500 million. They came to me and they said, we'd like to be able to contribute to the community, leave a legacy, and the highest and best use is no longer farming, but how do we pass this property on in a way that's consistent with our values? And so we looked at new urbanist communities all over the country. We went through a year-long process of identifying selection criteria, sent out RFPs and RFQs, and we narrowed the decision down to 3 developers, and we finally identified one. And after 8 months of using 2 top LA law firms, 8 months of negotiation, about $400,000 in legal fees, we'd reached an impasse. And the impasse was over the issue of control. So if you filled out this stakeholder interest chart, it might look like this: the 3 siblings, led by Susan, and the developer. These were their issues that were important to them, extracted over numerous meetings with them even before we went on the developer search. And then when we looked at the interests of the parties, we looked at how each one felt and what they needed as it relates to the issues. So if, for example, you looked at decision control, Susan said, we absolutely don't want some developer to be just doing whatever they want to our property that's been in our family for 3 generations. The developer said, I don't want a family that knows nothing about my business to dictate my timing, my aesthetic design choices, or anything. This was where our impasse was. By the way, they also differed in their interests regarding the developer fees. William was farming the property, and many of you may have dealt with farmers, but farmers are really tough negotiators because they're used to dealing with pennies per pound when they're selling product, and super shrewd. William's like, let's just eliminate the fee. They can make it up on the other end. So you can see the difference in the interests here. And what's nice about this chart organized in this way is you can see all the areas where the interests are aligned and not opposite, and then the 2 that were problematic. So this is one abbreviated example of how to fill out an interest chart. And there are many ways to do this. You can take a yellow pad out and at first line up your 2 various stakeholders, buyer and seller. Often we find that we think we've reached an agreement, and then the next day they come back, and it's like that old TV show Columbo. He's out the door. One more thing, one more thing. There are often parties lurking. So this interest chart is iterative. You may want to add, you may start with these 2 and add a few more stakeholders as well as you uncover more information. Again, it could be something as simple as a yellow pad. I do it in my head most of the time, and when a deal starts to get problematic, or I find I'm waking up in the middle of the night and trying to solve something, that's when I might commit it to a paper like this, when it starts to get too complicated. So let's talk about interests a little bit. And interests are what, like the orange, give us the opportunities to make the pie bigger. We find that rookie negotiators negotiate positions up at the top of the iceberg. Experienced negotiators ask the why question. I love this. The fellow up at the top is looking around saying, and the fish down below saying, if only he'd look down here and ask the question of our interest. So when you're trying to determine and fill out this chart, you might say, on the issue of blank, control, what does the developer need? And then that might fill in with something like full control. On the issue of timing, what does the seller need? Well, they might need immediate access to the property. So this is the way you start to get at completing that interest chart. And the beauty of the interest chart is it is relationship building. It gives us the chance to, as Stephen Covey said, ask directly what they need, solicit the information, and confirm and continue to update the analysis. Some of you might say, well, do you share this with them? In some situations, I've pulled people into a room and said, okay, enough. Let's get a whiteboard and get this all out. And then sometimes I just complete this for myself. Step 2 of the 3-step process, brainstorming actions. So what this is, remember, it's the how do we get them what they need so we can get what we want. And those actions that result from this are tied directly to the interest. We have definition here, possible options for satisfying interest through a negotiated agreement. So out of this interest chart, you can identify the interest and then say, well, what can we do for each of those so that we can help to expand the pie? In our course, what we like to do is we like to have a brainstorming activity. And you've all probably been involved in brainstorming somewhere. Remember, there are no bad ideas. We put everything on a whiteboard or flip chart and just throw out ideas. And then you come back later to tie them to interest. The reason we like brainstorming is because after dealing with a deal for a while, you tend to get myopic, and it helps to expand your own awareness of possibilities by bringing in other ideas. So let's come back full circle to Florida Farms and take a look at that interest chart and what we did in terms of action steps to solve this impasse. And these are some of the action steps that we came up with. This is a true story, and we finally broke that impasse by creating a developer oversight committee. And the other red box that you saw, the profit and developer fee, was we lowered the developer fee but enhanced the waterfall for profit to the developer. And everybody ended up happy with that solution. Like this, if you don't get what you want, it's a sign that you either did not seriously want it or that you tried to bargain over price. Not Mr. Einstein, but Rudyard Kipling said this. Step 3, what happens is there is no resolution. You sometimes heard this referred as BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement, consequence of no agreement. In our program, we initially called this step 3 consideration fighting alternatives, because our program developers were attorneys. I didn't like that name and debated it with them, and they said, but look, the ultimate result is we go to court. On a global scale, the ultimate result could be war. So we have to consider, could be, well, they'll unfriend you on Facebook, take the deal elsewhere, but we must consider all of the alternatives. And this is particularly difficult for us, those of us in the real estate industry, because by nature, by definition, we tend to be optimistic and don't want to look at not doing the deal, but it impacts your pricing and your final negotiation. And I alluded to this, if there is no resolution, stakeholders may independently try to harm the interests of others. Now, this doesn't mean when I say communicate the step 3, it doesn't mean if you don't do this deal, this is going to happen. It means you respectfully make everyone aware of the consequence of not doing the deal. And there's a great Steve Jobs story when he was going before the Planning Commission on the new building and the new Apple headquarters in Cupertino. You can find this on YouTube. And they were giving him a lot of trouble about it looks like a spaceship. And I love what he said. He said, you know, I grew up on these streets, and I rode my bike under the trees. I threw a ball out in the middle of the street, and I would hate to have to take this tax revenue base to another county. It was beautiful. It was respectful, but it let everyone know what the consequence would be in terms of not approving the project. So, one thing that is outside of the 3 steps, but everyone talks about in negotiations. And I'm going to show you a different one. I have a couple slides for this that I like a little bit better. There. Tactics are designed for one side only. Now, we talked about tactics in terms of steps and a process for implementing a strategic plan, but this is the tactics that people use from one side to the other, designed to get a competitive advantage, throw the other party off of their game. And we believe that a tactic, when it's recognized as a tactic, is really not a tactic at all. So what do I mean by that? We love to play these tactic games. Even the win-win negotiation books that you read about in the airport magazines when they used to have them, talked about, we're win-win players, but they devote a whole section on deploying tactics. We say that what a skilled negotiator will do, will say, just call the tactic, recognize what it is and say, okay, you know, now we recognize what you're doing. Now let's get back to the why of this. So a lot of conversation on that. This is our philosophy regarding tactics. Summary of the 3-step process: interest analysis, action steps, and what happens if there's no resolution. So I know that you might have questions, and before we go into Q&A, what I'd like you to do is just enter into the chat window something that you might be a takeaway for you that you would consider using, changing the lens on how you look at negotiations for your next negotiation. So go ahead and use the chat window now. What you might do differently, what a takeaway might be. Yeah, there's a lot of the why. Yes, Carol, consider the consequences. Control the internal. It's so important in today's time, market, everything that's going on externally. Look at the bigger picture. As it relates to the bigger picture, I like that comment in that it's easy in looking at the bigger picture to get lost in the emotion of a negotiation. And so when John says, look at the bigger picture, what I think he's talking about is taking a real strategic long-term goal for the negotiation. And early on, I was fortunate to have some great mentors in the business. And one of them said, and they negotiated on a global big deal basis. And one of them said, you know, you need to put everyone in a box. And that didn't make sense to me. But now the way that I interpret that is an interest chart, where if I succinctly look at the big picture, but define the various interests of each party in their own box, it keeps it from getting fuzzy. It keeps it from getting too emotional. It keeps me focused on direct input that I can deal with. These are great comments. Okay, so Dave, we said we'd have a few minutes for Q&A. Do we have any questions? I know I've been collecting them.
Let's see. All right, we touched on this a little bit actually, in different ways. Oops, hold on. Oh goodness. Okay. So it's been said that children are the best negotiators. Two questions. Why is that? And what do we learn either as habits or behavior as we get older, which makes us less effective negotiators?
Okay, that's great. Welcome to Psychology 101. So one thing is that they don't have confines of boundaries that we have learned to accept over time. And the other is that they are extremely focused on me, what I need, what I want, and they're also very persistent. And so this kind of negotiating with children takes a lot more, obviously, a lot more patience, but it's also an opportunity to, it's like the debate last night, I'm not answering the question directly, but I believe that it's because they just haven't learned the limitations that we've imposed on ourselves as we get older.
Okay. And I do have a couple more Q&A I'll read through.
Right. Okay.
For the audience, once again, you can use the Q&A box, type in I believe they're anonymous, if you're concerned about that. If you use the chat, I think it tells us who you are. Q&A can be anonymous. Go ahead and put some stuff in there and I'll get to them as I'm reading through the rest of these. Hold on, let me get this, let's see. How important is the delivery of the terms you want to negotiate? Is there a difference between a phone call versus an email or a text when trying to deliver your terms?
Yeah. Okay. So speaking both from experience and from studies, and a quick shout out to something called PON, Program on Negotiations from Harvard. If you want to get constant drip content into your email box, they have great articles. And this is where the research has come from. But we so frequently tend to just negotiate by chat or by text or by email. And if it's important enough and there's enough at stake, it's important to look the other person in the eye and pick up the visual cues and be able to also, from a relationship developing perspective, be able to let them know that you want to reach the why question. So that's my personal experience, but also the studies have shown that face-to-face negotiations have higher percentages of closing than non-face-to-face negotiations. So I think it's critical. And every time there's an opportunity to get rid of the technology and handle the negotiation directly, I feel, and my experience shows that a much more likelihood of success with that.
Okay. How willing have the agent on the other side of the deal been opening to sharing their client why when using this process?
Yep.
Many times people don't want to show their hand and their motivations.
Yep. So in this business and just in life in general, I take the approach that if somebody doesn't understand me, I haven't educated them well enough. And because we're dealing through agents most of the time, it's important to educate that agent as well. It takes a little bit more time, but once they understand our thought process and we can have the opportunity to have them shift their lens a little bit, then we might have more likelihood of reaching a solution. But if they're the roadblock, we're not going to get to the why. So sometimes it's like that, you know, dog grabbing onto your leg or your pant cuff and you're trying to shake it off. You have to just be that persistent like that dog and just keep going after it and keep going after it. But so it's not easy. It's not easy, but it's possible to educate the other party.
Yeah. All right. And this is topical, expands a little bit from an earlier question. How should one address Zoom negotiations?
Sometimes Zoom is the only, in today's world, Zoom is the only possible outcome or the only possible delivery medium. So one critical element is expose the videos. You have to be online. And then you prepare as well as possible with setting an agenda up, just like any other meeting that you would encounter, and allow for extra time to get to the why. Those are the three things that come to mind immediately. And I want to respond to Frank's comment or question. Do CCIMs who have been through the CCIM negotiating program have better success when they're across the table? Now, shout out to the program in general. There have been studies that show how much more average income CCIMs make. And yes, of course, we don't have any studies on the negotiating program, but yes, of course, if you employ these steps and most importantly, this philosophy, you have a better opportunity to, again, control and influence the outcome. That, again, doesn't mean that it's easy. It doesn't mean that you don't default to your old habit. And sometimes in the heat of difficult negotiations, I get all excited and then go, okay, wait a minute. If I can just remember to sit down and say, what do they need? No matter how difficult they are, what do they need? And then that causes me to pause. So again, probably, Frank, better success, I would say more likely success if you employ the tenets of the negotiating program. Now, it is 9:02, and I am happy to answer any questions if you want to reach out to me. The slides will be available. I put together kind of a fun reading list. The blue ones are more fun, mostly fiction. The black are textbook And here is my contact information. So please feel free to reach out as well. And I really appreciate your time. This has been fun and a great way to wrap this up. I've seen a lot of my friends on show up on the text, so it's nice to see you all. And I hope you're all safe and prosperous.
Great. Listen, I want to thank everyone. Patricia, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you, everyone who's joined us. I want to just leave everyone with that visual when negotiating with Patricia. That's a fierce competitor right there. So listen, thank you to our sponsors. Thank you to Patricia, the CCIM Institute, and everyone. And certainly, as we've said, reach out with any questions after the fact, and we'll get you these slides. Thank you, everyone, for your time and your patience.
Okay, take care. Bye.
See you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.